Right, good morning everybody. It's 10 o'clock now, so we'll get started. So thank you very much for joining the webinar this morning about GDPR. So for those of you that don't know too much about GDPR, hopefully this is what this webinar is going to cover and give you a really good kind of introduction to what it's about and also some key topics. We're also going to focus quite heavily on the cyber security side of things, which is absolutely key. For those of you that don't know me, my name is pdenham. My role at HBP is as commercial director, so this is a non-technical role basically. So I come at cybersecurity very much from a non-techie kind of role, so I'm a user. Obviously, I always think it's very important to get this balance right between security and obviously with GDPR legislation and making sure that people like myself, and I'm sure many of you, can just get on and do their jobs actually without thinking about this. But GDPR is hitting the news and people want to know about it. People want to know whether or not they should be worried about it and more importantly, what they need to do about it as well. So hopefully we're going to answer some of those questions today. So if we move on a slide. Right, so why GDPR? So GDPR, just to kind of clarify this is the General Data Protection Regulation. And ultimately what this is doing is giving businesses really a commercial decision about coping with cybercrime. Obviously, the impacts of cybercrime are big anyway in terms of things like ransomware, where data is encrypted and people have to pay ransoms to get it back, in terms of reputation. And this is adding another level to that commercial decision, which is about fines primarily. So there's going to be a level of fines put in place for people that don't take this seriously. But realistically, the actual advice is about tying up legislation from the past, best practice from nowadays, all about protecting your business data, keeping it up to date. And most importantly, the spirit of GDPR is all about protecting individuals' data as well. So if you think about your own personal data of when you hand that over to an insurance company or anyone else, then that is exactly why this put in place, basically. And also by doing nothing or not enough, you're accepting the risks that come with this financial, potential fines, potential ransoms, and also the disruption to your business as well. Now, GDPR itself is made up of around 99 different articles, so it's big. I've been through it. It's quite boring, if I'm honest. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and cover some of the parts that I think are most important for small and medium-sized businesses, obviously paraphrase these down in some respects as well, and hopefully give you a bit of an action plan to go through it. Now, I am still asking some of the questions about areas myself. So some of this there are some grey areas around this that are still getting clarified, and there have been a few clarified in the news recently. But feel free to ask questions. So if you do have any questions, there's a chat box in the GoToMeeting section that you've got. Feel free to bang any questions in there, and I will I'll ideally come to them at the end, or if they're relevant to the point that I'm talking about, we will go through that as well. Okay, so as it says on screen, the main reasons here then are to force businesses to act. So because these legislations are so out of date, they are different in every single European country, and they're a different level, and in many cases they're not that severe. So the idea is that they're going to push people to do things. As I mentioned, they're going to protect consumers and put us first. There's going to be one regulating body, so it's going to be easy to punish offenders, and a single line of guidance. And just to be clear, in the UK, you may have seen in the news probably about a couple of weeks ago now, there was an additional bill passed that basically, in a nutshell, said that when we do leave the EU, this will be continued into UK law pretty much verbatim. There may be a few little tweaks, but ultimately it's going to be the same law that comes in when we do leave the EU. So this is completely and utterly relevant now and going forward as well. So it comes in on the 25th of May 2018 in terms of it being enforced. Just so you're aware, this has actually been in place now it will be in place for 2 years when it hits May 2018. And that 2-year period is to give businesses time to basically get up to scratch with it and to make sure that they comply with it. The main areas are really around stricter rules on data management, so how we collect, use, and also delete our data. Also about how we can detect, report, and investigate on attacks. And under GDPR, we have 72 hours to be able to do that in order to comply. And like I say, once this comes in officially into 2018, 25th of May 2018, it means that it will be enforced, and the fines and things like that will start coming out and will start being used. And basically this covers anyone that's dealing with EU citizens or in the future UK citizens. So this doesn't just apply to us here in the UK or in the EU, but it also applies around the world as well. So this is a global kind of law. That's common for any of you that deal with the US, for example. You'll know that you have to comply with the US data laws and US legislation if you're dealing with people over there. So it's pretty common practice, and that's going to be the case in the EU now. And here's an example of why this is important. So if we think of why this has been done, laws across Europe were generally updated last between around 1995 and 1998. And if you have a look at this graph, this shows the total amount of malware that is recognised within the industry now. And when I talk about malware, this means malicious software. So we're talking here about any kind of virus, any kind of ransomware, basically anything you consider to be a cybercrime. These are the different types of software that are now known. So obviously we're pushing towards 700 million different variations of this, and you can see how it's changed. So from during the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s, well, there are very few strains. The main change has been monetisation, in that people are now making money out of this. So things like ransomware are a really good example of that. And just to kind of reiterate that, that's when someone encrypts your data, so effectively gets hold of your data, puts a very, very strong password on it, and then charges you a fee to get that password and have it unencrypted. And you see how that's just absolutely rocketed. So the laws and legislations that are in place in the mid to late 90s obviously need to be updated to cope with what's happening in today's world. So in terms of the fines, as I mentioned, we've got this one law. So initially this came out and it was 20 million euros is the fine. This has been now quantified in the UK. That will be 17 million pounds, or 4% of your organisation's global turnover, whichever is highest. So these are obviously high. In the UK at the moment, the current highest fine that can be dished out is £500,000. So this is a significant increase. And it's deliberately high. It's deliberately high to act as a deterrent, and also to be proportionate as well. So obviously the larger companies that can only be fined up to £500,000 now are going to have that significantly increased. What we're also seeing as well are more legal cases being filed for where there are significant data breaches that cause damage to the people who had their data lost in question. And actually, in many cases, these legal cases can be much higher than the fines that are likely to come from GDPR. So it is quite significant, but realistically, these are quite scary numbers, but they are deliberately scary numbers because it's not enforced strongly enough at the moment. And as we've seen so many times in the news, large companies not taking data security seriously enough and losing our data. The aim is to try and deter them from doing that and take it more seriously with these fines. I'm going to break down GDPR into two areas today. So this is keeping it as simple as we possibly can. And if we break it down, we've basically got two areas: data processing, so how we manage our data, if you like, the data flow within our business, how it comes in, how we use it, and how we remove it. And then cyber security, so how we're protecting our IT infrastructure, how we're trying to stop data leaks happen, how we're trying to stop hacks happen, etc. So I will talk about these two areas separately. The first one is probably where there's the biggest amount of grey area. Now, I do want to stress that GDPR isn't a list of things that we have to do. It's a list of guidance. So it needs to be interpreted differently for your own business in terms of your size, also in terms of the sensitivity of the data that you hold. So this is where some grey areas can come up because people are obviously questioning how it kind of impacts them individually. And obviously, like I say, if you have any questions, I will do my best to answer those on an individual basis, absolutely. So in terms of this process, we talk about this in terms of enhanced rights. So the first stage of this enhanced rights is called the right for erasure, which is also known as the right to be forgotten. So basically this means that if somebody holds my records, for example, I can phone them up and I can tell them that I want to be removed from their database completely. There are some exceptions to this. So, for example, if there's another legislation that overrules this where you have to keep that data legally, there's some financial legislations around that, criminal convictions, things like that, for example, that would overrule GDPR, and GDPR understand that kind of concept that certain things have to be kept to meet other legislations. The other one is that if the person was under the age of 18 when the data was collected, then there's kind of you have to delete that. Basically, that there's kind of no exceptions if that gets requested. But in general, it's a case of someone requesting that and you following that through in the spirit of GDPR. And obviously, the spirit of GDPR is about protecting that individual's data. So to give that financial example, let's say you had some financial data that you had to keep. There was a reason why you had to keep it, but you also had that person on your mailing list. There'd be no reason under a request to be forgotten that you couldn't delete those records from the mailing list and any marketing material, even though you had to keep the other bit that was required under a different piece of legislation. So you have to act, like I say, to protect the person's data and in the spirit of GDPR. The right for portability means that we're able to transfer information from one company to another. I know some people can find this particularly difficult between insurance companies, for example, or pension providers, where those companies almost feel like they own your data and they won't pass that on. Well, under GDPR, it will be covered. So we will have the right to portability to request our data be moved from one provider to another. In terms of gathering data, GDPR talks about explicit consent. So this is already good practice from a marketing point of view in general. So if you are getting people to sign up for a newsletter or sign up for future communications from your sales team, you in general are looking for explicit consent. So from a marketing point of view, this might be ticking a box on a form to say, yes, I'm happy to receive your emails. And in some cases, what they call double opt-in, where you get an email through that says, do you definitely want to receive them? And you click again. So that is considered best practice, and that is absolutely what GDPR is looking to do and looking to enforce. In the B2B world, it's a little bit more ambiguous. We've been able to use something in the B2B world called implied consent, which is something really that's based on what was termed as an existing business relationship, which is, of course, incredibly vague. Could mean that you met them once 3 years ago at a networking event, got their business card, and that's considered to be a business relationship. Obviously, under GDPR, those things will start to disappear, and we'll start be looking at this explicit consent process, and we'll be able to have to prove that as businesses as well. And when we look at proving that, that might just be as simple as recording when that time was, that date and that time of when someone said, yes, give us a call, we'll have a chat. And obviously from an online point of view, managing when people signed up to your newsletters and things like that. So ultimately, like I say, this is really about working within the spirit of GDPR. So you really need to be in a position where if you were ever questioned, you could stand up and say, this is the process we've put in place. This is why we believe we've put the individual's data protection first. This is the record that we've got where they have given explicit consent. And then the flip side of that as well, easy removal of consent. So if they say they no longer want to receive your communications, whatever they come from, it should be an easy process to remove them. Now, there are a couple of exceptions to this, and when it comes to IT, there's a few that crop up from our side of things. For example, if someone requests to be deleted from your database, that should be a relatively straightforward process. And in general, you're probably doing that already. If I phoned up, I'm sure anyone on this webinar and said, please never contact me again, you'd delete me from your database, and that wouldn't happen. There is some tricky elements around that, and if we think about data backups from an IT point of view, it's very hard and virtually impossible in most scenarios to delete an individual record from something like a backup. So if you were to remove my data and then in a couple of months' time you needed to restore something for whatever reason and you brought my data back online, technically you would be in breach of GDPR if you then continue to contact me. But of course, what GDPR is looking for you to do is to protect that individual and take all the necessary steps within the size of your business, within the sensitivity of the data that can be considered necessary. So if you, for example, kept a log of the people that had been deleted and then at backup time you then went through and removed them, that would obviously be considered a necessary step, an absolutely perfect way to deal with it. If you are dealing with data on a much more sensitive basis and potentially backups are happening on much more regular occurrence, then you might need to put in something a little bit more structured. So you can get backups that actually do enable you to delete people on an individual basis, for example, or that kind of log process becomes a very structured process in your backup, in that backup scenario. But ultimately, like I say, you need to be able to stand in front of someone if you ever question and say, this is the process we've put in place and this is what we've done about it. Obviously, mistakes will happen. We don't know how that will be viewed until it comes in, but the likelihood is, again, if you could stand up and say, look, we've got a process, this is what we go through, and this is an exception to the rule, then you should be okay. But there obviously is going to be a lot of grey area around that because it's going to depend on every single business and how we manage our own data. Right, I'm just going to cover this one briefly, only because it comes up a lot when people read about GDPR and there's questions around it. And this is data protection officers, or DPOs, as they're referred to. It's very unlikely to affect anyone on this webinar because I think in general most people will consider themselves either a small or a medium-sized business. But you must have a DPO if you're a public authority. If you're carrying out large-scale monitoring or processing of data, or if you're processing data relating to criminal convictions as well. So it's unlikely you're going to need this, but it's one of these things that hits the headlines and sounds quite serious. It's also important to point out that even the larger companies that are dealing with this this person doesn't need to be a lawyer or from a legal background. Actually, this is about having someone that understands your processes. So although we're talking legislation and legal here, it doesn't automatically mean that you're going to need a lawyer. Actually, the best sort of people to understand this are people that understand your business, probably understand marketing and sales because that's where a lot of the data collection happens, and have that mindset to understand kind of those grey areas around legislation as well. As I say, though, the chances of you needing this are pretty slim. If you're not sure, I would suggest that you just do a specific search around data protection officers and the GDPR, and it will lay out exactly when that comes in. But I do think it's quite unlikely that anyone on this webinar will need that. Okay, so let's move on to the security side of things. So from a security side of things, actually the advice we're given hasn't really changed. GDPR is really, like I say, bringing together legislation from a long time ago and also bringing together best practice. So the advice that we've been giving to businesses for the last couple of years and probably will continue to do for the next couple of years is pretty similar. There's a few tweaks here and there, but ultimately this is about protecting your business. So this is the line that we've been using for a long time now. So if you were hacked, could you basically deal with these things? So pay a £50,000 ransom. We say that because as a business, we've had a company contact us who had a cyber breach. It was ransomware. This was the ransom that was put upon them. Could you afford to lose up to 6 months worth of data? In this scenario as well, the company didn't have a suitable backup structure in place and had the option of losing 6 months worth of data. Could you explain a data breach? So could you actually go back out to your customers and tell them that you'd lost their records and what had gone on? What would it do to your reputation? And of course, we've been saying as well, could you comply with GDPR? Because it's always been on the agenda and it's always been coming up and creeping up on us as time comes. And of course, we're only now looking at May next year when this will be enforced. So our line hasn't really changed because yes, GDPR is important, but those three other areas are really key as well, about financial loss, about, if you like, the data, which is your time of rekeying that or bringing that back into business, or the loss of information that you need to run your business, and of course around reputation as well, of actually explaining that to your customers. So what is happening? Why is this such a big kind of area? And obviously you've seen malware, as my graph earlier showed, going up and up and up. And what we're seeing now is that there are an increased number of attacks, both in terms of volume, but also in terms of value. There are a lot of these super cases that hit the news where you see huge amounts of data being stolen, and in many cases as well, huge ransoms being requested. But we are seeing this becoming more and more common. We're also seeing it become more complex. So, of course, because we're all putting in more and more defences now, cybercriminals are having to become cleverer with what they do. They're having to look at new ways to try and break down the existing defences. And this will always be a game of cat and mouse in the security world, where as soon as the security industry catches up, the cybercriminals are going to look and find ways to crack that. And ultimately, if you present enough people with a problem, one of them is going to find a way to get through it, basically. And as I mentioned as well, monetisation. So virtually all attacks are monetised now. Virtually all major attacks are monetised, either directly or indirectly. And most of them nowadays are coming through ransomware. This is the most common one that we're seeing on the news. That the easiest way to monetise something is to take someone's data, to, like I say, encrypt it, put this password around it, and then charge them to be able to get it back. What we're also predicting once GDPR's come in is not only will it be a case of we've encrypted your data, but also the fact that we will leak this publicly. So we'll put you at risk of GDPR fines, even to the point that they may even threaten to report you themselves. Now, under GDPR, we've got 72 hours to react to that as businesses. So to detect it, first and foremost, if need be, to inform our customers or anyone that's had their data lost, and also to report ourselves to the ISO, who are the governing organisation that are carrying out GDPR in the UK. So we do have to do this, and we can see how the cyber criminals will kind of jump on that chance as well. In terms of why it's happening, so it does make money. I talk about it being monetized. Just as an example, in Russia, the average wage is around $500. A cyber criminal is making around $7,500 a month. So it's pretty lucrative for the people to want to get it, to get into it. We pick on Russia there. Russia's not the only country, of course. There is a lot of cybercrime that seems to originate from Russia, but this is a global problem. This is happening all over the place. In the UK, for example, the average attack was worth around £8,600 to the cyber criminal. So it's happening in the UK too. So therefore, it's worth putting in the time and effort. And we're also seeing it is being made easy, not by everyone. There are plenty of people taking it very seriously, but certainly not the majority. So there are plenty of ways that people can hack systems, can take data, and can make money from it. So there are lots and lots of things to do. The other thing we've seen as well is that businesses take this as a bit of a one-stop shop. So yes, they make an investment in cybersecurity maybe a couple of years ago, and then that's it. They don't touch it. Whereas actually this needs to be an ongoing process now. And finally, very hard to trace. So this is a little bit of a, I always think this is a bit of a bugbear of mine, because this is one of the reasons I'm fascinated by it. In reality, what we're talking about here is organised crime. And the fact that actually we're not really doing anything globally to stop this as organised crime. In fact, if you look at GDPR from a reverse view, we're getting punished as businesses if we get hacked. It's a little bit like saying that if my house got broken into, not only would I lose all my stuff, but somebody would also fine me for that process, rather than to try and to catch the people who did it or to stop that kind of process outright. But that is, unfortunately, that's what we're up against. And it's very hard to trace, because obviously the people that are carrying out these hacks are good at what they do. And part of what they do is making sure that they're not found. If in the case they are found and it's cross-border, being able to prosecute cross-border is very, very difficult. There are a few arrangements between certain countries, but in general, let's stick with Russia. Let's say we found out that a cyber criminal in Russia had hacked our network, stole a load of data, and we reported that. The chances of someone in the UK being able to prosecute someone in Russia are virtually nil. The chance of Russia kind of getting on board with that and helping us to bring them to justice is just not going to happen in the current kind of political situation with things. And that just to make that clear, that doesn't just go for Russia. That goes across the world where there aren't these agreements to do this sort of thing. Not just to do with cybercrime, but really to do with all crime. So yeah, it makes it very hard to trace and obviously very hard to stop in that respect. Now, I mentioned earlier that we see some of this stuff firsthand. I just want to give you the sort of example to show you what is sort of happening, just to kind of put this into context. So a common kind of ransomware attack often starts with email. So an email comes in directed to an end user. The whole idea of this is it bypasses spam defense, either by looking very genuine or because there's no spam defense there to begin with. That hits the end user. They open something in that, so something like an attachment, or they follow a link and download something. And ultimately what that's then doing is using the permission of that PC to reach out to other things. So in this example, it's reaching out to the server where that user potentially has access to shared files or something like that, and it's then encrypting that data for ransom. So this is quite a common kind of process of what it takes, and obviously, as you can see, there's some elements there of potentially outdated equipment, of not having necessary security in there, and also the human element as well that comes into it. Another example, and I mentioned earlier the worst case scenario that we'd seen that had the 50k ransom, the loss of data. The attack I'm about to show you was that basically. I'd just like to stress that this wasn't a company that had invested in cybersecurity. It was the first time they'd contacted us and spoke to us, and that is quite common. We get people speak to us and say, right, we need to do something about it. We've been hacked. Quite often they end up having to pay a ransom, and then they have to make an investment in cybersecurity. So it's a bit of a kind of a double whammy for them when that happens. But in this scenario, what was happening was the cybercriminals were effectively looking for IP addresses of routers. So this is basically the address of the router that's out there publicly on the internet, which if you've got the right software and you know what you're doing, you can go and find. And that could be quite legitimate. It could be for some web services, for some remote users, something to do with their website. So it's more than possible that could be out there. And what it's then looking for is it's looking for that open router port, so effectively looking for a connection directly into the router. Once it's got that router, it's then looking for that connection to the server, and it's then attempting to brute force that password, also known as the dictionary attack. So effectively chuck in lots and lots of variations of username and password at that until it gets in. And because it's cracking in that way through the actual admin password, it's then very easily able to encrypt the data for ransom, because obviously as an admin, it can even uninstall if there is any protection on their antivirus and things like that. Now, when this happened, we actually saw several similar attacks happening in the local area, and we contacted a few companies who we're friendly with around the country, and they saw very similar things as well. And this happened within about a 48-hour period. And in all cases, that router in the middle of this picture was out of date. It was an old router that wasn't looking for these sort of attacks, that wasn't aware that it could kind of spot them. So, for example, a modern router would be able to lock out based on, if you say, 3 different attempts at using the username and password, a bit like our online accounts do or our phones do. But because this was an old router, it wasn't looking for that sort of thing, and it wasn't monitoring this sort of activity. So it could have been easily stopped in that case. Okay, so hopefully I've given you an idea of where that sits from a cybersecurity point of view. What I always like to do now is give you a bit of an action point, because we've been doing these sort of seminars and talking about these scenarios for a number of years now. And I'm always keen that people don't go away terrified and don't think, well, what on earth do I do next? So I'm going to give you an example of what we offer, what we do as a company, and what we recommend. Now, obviously, we're a Sophos partner. You might know that already. I might have seen that from some of our slides when I've been talking about it. We use Sophos because they basically offer all of this solution in one go. So it all talks to each other. All the elements that you need all come from one provider. So it's very good from a small and medium-sized business point of view to tie this all together nice and easily. But then we also have a service wrap around that to do, like I say, the proactive stuff that you need to make sure everything's up to date. So if we start, we'll talk about here from a network security point of view and network configuration. And network configuration is not just a one-time fix. Yes, it needs to be set up properly, but it also needs to evolve and develop with your business. So on screen here, sorry for the slightly busy slide, but ultimately on the left-hand side, what is a threat? Network configuration. So the solution comes in 3 parts here. So the advanced configuration of all network elements. So obviously making sure someone sets them up with cybersecurity in mind. To make sure it's done properly and it's done safely and securely. Increase and regularly update the complexity of usernames and passwords. There's some debate over what's best, regularly updating them or having them incredibly complex. Our personal view is complexity, but there are things like Cyber Essentials, ISO 27001 that still recommend regularly updating. So there's a little bit of difference in that scenario, but realistically, if you do both, if you make your passwords just a little bit better, update them on a more regular basis, chances are it's going to be better than what you've got now. So definitely taking that seriously. And also having a backup solution and procedure in place. Sorry, I skipped over this, but when I was talking about the company that got this ransom of £50,000, and I mentioned about 6-month data loss, well, actually their server was encrypted, but that server had access to the backup, and they encrypted the backup as well. What they weren't doing is changing their backup tape each night. So every single night that was overwriting the data on that, and they hadn't changed it for 6 months. So not only was it encrypted, but no one had been changing the tape. So there wasn't one from last night or from a week ago or for however often they wanted to update it. So that was a scenario where they had to lose 6 months worth of data in that, or obviously pay the ransom, which is what they did in the end. So in terms of the products, on the right hand side, we have something called our Advanced Security Frameworks. This is a proactive approach. This is like having a cybersecurity expert who comes back on a regular basis to monitor what's going on, to apply updates and things like that to how it's set up. Remote monitoring, so we can see what's going on a regular basis and obviously identify anything early. 2 levels of backup, both on-site and remote, so we can restore stuff easily. We've got here message defense or pure mail, so effectively a spam solution. And also looking at synchronized security. So this is where actually all of the elements of your network talk to each other. So if, for example, my PC here got infected, it would instantly be quarantined by the network, so it couldn't then touch any other computers, the server, or in fact any other element of the network until it was considered to be clean again. And then here I've got a picture of Windows XP. So we're talking here about outdated equipment, and outdated equipment is a massive target. It's a massive target for cyber criminals because it's not being updated anymore by the vendors in terms of patches, in terms of security updates. So outdated equipment, massive risk. So in that scenario, what should we be doing? Well, first and foremost, we should be patching and updating our operating systems and software. So the things we have got, where updates are released, there should be absolutely a process in place to update them on a regular basis as needed. And again, that goes for everything from your desktop PC right through to your server and everything else in between, and replacing old equipment completely. So the obvious example here is Windows XP, but as I mentioned in the scenario earlier, old routers and things like that that could be completely out of date and not up to scratch with what we need nowadays. In terms of what we offer, we have our proactive essential maintenance service, which is effectively having, again, an engineer on site on a regular basis to carry out basic IT admin. Windows Server updates, having the latest version of the Windows Server, our Sophos UTM device, which is effectively both a firewall and it controls basically all the elements of your network as well, including all your Wi-Fi and your web controls. And then I've put here Windows 10, but ultimately an operating system that's supported as well. So 7, Windows XP we know is out of date, 7's now in extended support, 8 and 10 currently in full support. So that's where we need to be from an operating system point of view. And finally, the word that comes out a lot in IT, PEBCAC, or the problem exists between the chair and the computer. So this is the user, and when I say the user, this is me, all of you, everyone you work with, everyone you know. There are no exceptions to this rule. In fact, we often see some of the biggest culprits of this being directors and decision makers within businesses and technical people, because either they think they're kind of not the threat, or in the technical case, maybe they think they're above the threat and don't need to worry so much. So this is 100% everybody. And this, until recently, has probably been one of the hardest areas to protect against. So first and foremost, in terms of the solution, we do need to educate our users. We need to do regular training and make sure people understand what's going on with cybersecurity. We also need to do the big brother thing and restrict access, enforce security policies. So we need to make sure they are changing their passwords and making them secure enough. We need to make sure they can't get to the bits of the server or log into a piece of software that they really don't need to. But then we also need to realise as well that we might have to protect against stupidity. So we might have to think things may happen. And if they do happen, what protection have we got in place? And you see on the right hand side now, there's several areas that we can protect against this. So antivirus in InterceptX is a really important one. So our standard antivirus is looking for basically known threats. So effectively think of a big list of viruses, what we call signatures, so the way that it's made up, what it looks like, and it stops them coming into our network. InterceptX is then looking at behavior. So if something comes in that it's never seen before, but it tries to, let's say, rapidly encrypt files, so from a ransomware point of view, which is what it does, then InterceptX is actually looking at that behavior and saying, right, there's nothing I want on my PC or on my network that is going to rapidly encrypt files. So stop that in its tracks. And it also keeps a little cache or a little memory of those files and rolls them back to where they were. So it can protect against that behavior as well straight away to prevent that data breach. CryptoGuard and Sandstorm add a similar level of protection without going into too much detail on your server. Encryption is a really important one. So GDPR mentions a lot about encryption. So if you think of, let's reverse the idea of ransomware where somebody takes your data and encrypts it. If you do that the other way, in that only people who are on your network and have a proper network login can see your data because it's encrypted to anyone else, Actually, if someone steals your data and takes it outside your network, it's all scrambled up and useless to anyone. And GDPR understands that and basically says that if your data is encrypted and covered, then you wouldn't be in breach of it if you were to have a data loss. So encryption will become a really, really important one. We've also then got a fish threat, and I'll give you a little example of this because this is quite a cool one that's come out recently about how we can train our staff, because it is a difficult one of thinking you've got all these members of staff who won't have sat on this webinar, who won't have had training and won't be reading GDPR regulations. How will they keep up to date? Fish threat effectively tests them, so we send out what look like dodgy emails and we see who clicks on them, and anyone that does click on them is then directed to some training. So they immediately kind of get educated to say this is what you've done wrong and this is how you can avoid doing it in the future, which is really, really powerful from our experience. And then MDM as well, mobile device management. So this is about the way the world is changing and the fact that very few of us now have one device. We have a mobile phone that's got company information on it, even if it's just in our email. We have tablets. We have all sorts of things basically. So MDM gives us a chance to control them in terms of what can go on those devices. But probably most importantly, it gives us the opportunity to remote wipe them as well. So if something is ever lost, we can immediately wipe it and again stop that potential data loss in its tracks as soon as we know about it. Okay, so let me just I'll just show you this fish threat because I think it's a really cool way of showing how the world of cybersecurity is catching up and really thinking about these threats seriously. So in this scenario, what I'd do is I'd pick a layout. So here we've got Adopt a Pet, Amazon Prime, and I've picked one of those. So right, that's the one I'm going to send out to my end users. I'd also then pick some training. So this is what I want them to go through. And then once I'd sent that out, I could then report on that. And I can do two things. I can either actually just send out training and say, before I test you all do some training and you've got to go through this and we can track it. Or once I've done that, I can start testing them as well. And in my report, I'll show you my report here. This is when we just sent out a training campaign internally. This was just after it went, which is why you can see that most people haven't started it. But ultimately, I can see who's carried out that training, who's completed it, who's still waiting for it to be done. And if it was a scenario where I'd be sending out spam emails as well, I could see who'd been clicking on them. So actually, if I've got a member of staff who regularly clicks on them and constantly gets fooled by them, I can obviously speak to that person and give them some additional training or take the necessary measures if we think it's obviously a real risk from the type of emails that are coming into them as well. And just to sort of show you how that works within our industry, so we do this. You see here, this is the Amazon Prime one I just showed you. This is what happened in our industry. So first and foremost, there was an email went around from a member of staff who said, watch out everybody, there's an email going around, it looks dodgy. And then we also use something called Yammer, which is a Microsoft product, which is a bit like an internal social media site for sharing information. And again, someone posted it up on there and said, look out, there's an email going around, be careful of it. So you actually get your staff start to look out for each other as well and help to protect your network collectively. So it's we've seen it as being a really, really powerful one to help that user education and keep you safe. So what we're talking about here is a layered approach, and the analogy we like to use is about fishing nets. So if you think that every single thing that I've talked about there, and I appreciate it is an extensive list, is another layer of protection. So if we just have antivirus, for example, it's just a single fishing net protecting our business. As we add more and more levels of protection against that, we add an extra fishing net on top every single time, and the holes get smaller and smaller as we do that. Obviously, with all these things, like I say, the cyber criminals are always going to look for a way to get through, but it's about making it as difficult as we possibly can from a commercial point of view, and from a GDPR point of view, it's about making sure we've taken the necessary steps, making sure we've done everything we possibly can to protect those individuals' data that we might hold. Okay, so in terms of what next, this is obviously a little bit over to you guys in terms of GDPR. Like I say, from a process point of view, it very much depends on how you manage your data. But if you always think about the spirit of GDPR in terms of actually looking after those individual data records, if you do ever get any requests for removal, taking them seriously and making sure you put the process in place to ensure that stays in place. And from a security point of view, about taking the necessary steps. So obviously you'll know about the sensitivity of data that you've got and how important that is. And if you were ever questioned, to say if you did have a data breach and were ever a question, could you say, yes, we have taken this seriously, we've put in necessary measures, we've done everything we possibly can to stop us getting hacked. And also think, forget GDPR for a minute. This is important. Having a hack, having a sort of a data breach or a hack is not a nice experience for any business. We see this obviously from an IT point of view when it does happen. It takes businesses offline. It means they can't work. It means they have data loss. In some cases, they have to tell their customers, or their customers are made aware. It's not good for reputation. It's not a nice scenario to be in. So realistically, you want to do everything you possibly can to stop that happening. Okay. That's everything for today. Obviously, question-wise, if anyone's got any that wants to send through any chat at the moment, they're more than welcome to. If not, I've put my email on screen there. You're more than welcome to email me directly. We have recorded today's webinar as well, so we'll make sure we get that distributed out to everybody, unless they tell us otherwise, of course, and they want to be removed, which we obviously will follow through on, no problem whatsoever. But yes, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me. If it is something that's very specific to your business and you don't want to ask it on chat at the moment, feel free to drop me an email. I'm more than happy to have a conversation with you about it. So thank you very much for your time. I'll stick around for sort of 5-10 minutes on the webinar just in case anyone does have any questions, and we'll do our best to answer them. So thank you very much.